This is the final Sunday for the summer semester. We'll be resuming Sunday school the second Sunday of September. The other thing you'll want to be on the lookout for is Wednesday classes will begin on September the 13th. You'll want to watch the keys for a catalog of things that will be coming up. So look forward to that. We're going to start today with Deuteronomy 22:13, but I'm actually going to jump ahead just a little bit to make an important point. So in Deuteronomy 22:13, we come back to Deuteronomy's sort of dealing with issues related to human sexuality. And once again, I think that one of the things that can happen, right, is as you read through various laws, it's easy to sort of miss the vision behind the various laws. So I want to say a word about the vision before we look at all the specifics. And I think that one way of thinking about what we're getting here in Deuteronomy and the Old Testament in general is this. One of the things that's really important about thinking about human sexuality, and this has become really clear in the last 20, 30 years, is putting it in the right context. That's one of the big debates that's really going on in the church that sort of underlies all issues related to human sexuality. And I think in some ways, right, we're confronted with a choice that looks something like this. On one hand, one way to approach human sexuality is to see it in a sort of very individualized way in which the basic idea is, well, the meaning of human sexuality is essentially what I want it to be. It's about my freedom and me doing what I want to do and engaging in what makes me happy. That's a perennial way of looking at the reality of human sexuality. And that way of looking at it is the way that we've gotten into through sin. That's sort of I think a helpful way of kind of putting that into a larger context. So what we're finding in Deuteronomy is we're finding that what the law is about is, you might want to think about it this way, one of the things the law is trying to do is it's trying to redeem human sexuality and pull it back into the context of God's purposes and plan for humankind. And to be very brief, we'll see this as we go through. To be very brief about this, the idea here is that the context for thinking about human sexuality is essentially covenantal. So what do I mean by that? Well, I mean something like this. That the first question that we have to ask ourselves when we start thinking about human sexuality is, why did God make us sexual creatures? What was God's purpose in doing that? And I think the Old Testament offers or begins to offer a really wonderful answer. And that answer is this, that God created human sexuality because it's sort of at the center of the male-female relationship that we call marriage. And human sexuality actually enables human beings to participate in God's creative plan. That is, the fact that we have the capacity to produce new human life is in effect a way of us recognizing that God has shared part of his creative power with us. And therefore, right, we can say that human sexuality has two fundamental purposes. Fundamental in the sense that you can't lose sight of them. Purpose number one, human sexuality serves to form the bond between husband and wife. And therefore, that's its only divinely appointed context. It's a gift that's been given to us by God, but it's a gift that's been given to us to be used in a certain context, and that context is the covenantal bond between husband and wife. To abstract it from that relationship is to abuse the gift. And the second purpose of human sexuality is procreation, the conceiving of children and their being nurtured and raised, as the wedding liturgy puts it, in the knowledge and love of the Lord. So those are the two kind of fundamental purposes of human sexuality, and it's really important, I think, that we grasp another thing, and after this we're going to go on to take a look at Deuteronomy 24. It's really important to understand, right, that God created things this way because he actually sort of created human sexuality with these purposes because he knew that in fulfilling those two purposes, that's what would really make us truly happy. The problem, right, is that under sin, we get the idea that using our sexual capacities in other ways will really make us happy, and it never really turns out that way. So I think it's really important to kind of grasp what's going on here in Deuteronomy, and that is the whole of human sexual life is being sort of pulled back into its covenantal framework, and therefore it's being redeemed. Okay, so having said that, I want us to take a look very quickly, and this this should help, I think, set a context for things. This is Deuteronomy 24, 1 through 4. It's the instruction concerning divorce, and then we're going to take a look at how Jesus handles this in Matthew 19, just to make a point. So this is the Mosaic provision regarding divorce. When a man takes a wife and marries her, if then she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, and she departs out of his house, and if she goes and becomes another man's wife, and the latter man hates her and writes a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house. Or if the latter man dies, who took her to be his wife, then her former husband, who sent her away, may not take her again to be his wife, after she has been defiled. For this is an abomination before the Lord, and you shall not bring sin upon the land that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance. So notice what's going on here. What this law is attempting to deal with, among other things, is what you might call sort of like serial marriage, right? So a man marries woman X, for some reason decides that he no longer wants that to happen, divorces her, writes her a certificate of divorce, she goes off, marries another man. He decides that he doesn't like her and writes her a certificate of divorce. She then can't go back and like remarry her former husband, because in effect that would be serial marriage. And I think this is a really important point, right? The whole point here is that the idea of there being sort of serial marriage undermines the whole purpose of marriage, which is a lifelong bond between two people that's capable of reflecting the bond that God has with his people. Right? If all marriage is a bond between two people that can simply be broken at will again and again and again and again, its value as a sign of the relationship between God and his people disappears. Right? And that's what this law is getting at, among other things. We're also seeing here, and this is important too, right? We're also seeing here Deuteronomy sort of closing in and doing something that's really strange in this culture, and that is, it's limiting the ability of husbands to divorce their wives. It's placing limitations on that power that they have. We'll see in a minute that Jesus actually places an even greater limitation. Now, another thing about this story, and this will be relevant for the passage I'm about to read to you from Matthew 19. Notice here that the law allows the husband to divorce his wife if he's found some indecency in her. Now, as you can imagine, right, as time goes on, there's a whole body of interpretation that grows up around this law. I mean, it's sort of like, American law, right? Congress passes a law that says something, and then, someone, raises, well, what does it mean when they say, X, Y, and Z? What does that mean? And then there's a whole court case, and then it goes to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court tells us what it means, and then somebody else comes along and says, well, what does this mean? And then there's a whole other court case. It goes to the Supreme Court, and, on and on and on. And, a lot of lawyers get rich in the process, and, all of us have to suffer. Anyway, so there's a whole body of interpretation that grows up around this phrase, indecency. And by the time that we get to Jesus' day, there's sort of like two camps, and this will be relevant for looking at Matthew 19. One camp says that indecency here means almost anything. So one school of interpretation even says, if the wife burns dinner one night, that's grounds for divorce. So indecency, conceivably, right, in this way of interpreting, sort of means almost anything. On the other hand, there's another school that says the only thing that would sort of count as indecency would be an adulterous relationship. So there's a sort of a dispute in Jesus' day about what this law means. So let's see how Jesus actually decides to handle it. So this is Matthew 19. Jesus is asked about this, and he's actually, this text is quoted to him. So let's take a quick look at it. This is Matthew 19, verse 1. Now, when Jesus had finished saying these sayings, he went away from Galilee and entered the region of Judea beyond the Jordan, and large crowds followed him, and he healed them there. And the Pharisees came up to him and tested him by asking, is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause? So there's that question, right? The Pharisees come up to Jesus, and this is like a trap because they know this is a controversial question. So, right? It's a controversial question, so regardless of how he answers it, he's going to make someone mad. That's strategy here, okay? He answered, have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female? And said, therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let not man separate. They said to him, why then did Moses command one to give a certificate of divorce and to send her away? So they're now referring to that passage we just looked at, Deuteronomy 24. And he said to them, I mean, you can sort of get a sense of what's happening. So they're responding to what Jesus says in a sort of very kind of lawyerly way. But Jesus, it says right here in the marriage code, under paragraph 7, section 8, subsection 17, it says that, So what do you have to say about that? So they said to him, then why did Moses command you to give a certificate of divorce and send her away? He said to them, because of your hardness of heart, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery. So this is what Jesus is doing here. This is really important, right? He's aware of the Deuteronomy 24 passage, and that's what the Pharisees have chosen to focus on. But he's also aware of a more deeper reality. That is, Jesus actually goes back to the first 2 chapters of the book of Genesis and says, now, before we deal with that, we kind of have to think about what God's intention for marriage was in the beginning. So what to think about that? And so he cites this passage, right, first of all from Genesis 1, that God made male and female in his image, right? So the idea right here is that men and women actually, in their own particular way, reflect the image of God. So it's not that each one of us fully reflects the image of God. It's that men and women together reflect the image of God. They're two forms of humankind, and together they reflect the one image of God. And therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. Literally, almost like one person, right? Two people joined together in the covenant of marriage. It's almost like they now become like one person, right? They're like bound together. And Jesus says, well, that was the divine intention. That was the divine purpose. The only reason why Moses gave you a sort of permission to divorce is not because it's your right to do it, which is what they think, but rather it's a concession to your hardness of heart. It's a concession to your hardness of heart and you're straying from God's purposes. So I think this is a really important thing. And one more passage just to kind of fill this in, I think is also important. This is at the very end of the Bible in Revelation 19. So we're getting to the end of Revelation, the final new heaven and new earth in Revelation 21. But in Revelation 19:6, something really important happens. And it's this. Then I heard what seemed to me the voice of a great multitude, like the roar of many waters, like the sound of mighty peals of thunder, crying out, Hallelujah! For the Lord our God, the Almighty, reigns. Let us rejoice and exult and give him the glory. And here it is. For the marriage of the Lamb has come, and his bride has made herself ready. It was granted her to clothe herself with fine linen, bright and pure, for the fine linen is the righteous deeds of the saints. And the angel said to me, Write this, Blessed are those who are invited to the marriage supper of the Lamb. So notice what's going on here. The point that Jesus is making in Matthew 19 is that the real purpose of marriage is to serve as a sign of the kind of relationship that Christ has with his bride, the church. That human relationship, right, between husband and wife, its sort of ultimate purpose is to sort of literally be sort of like a sign, and today we call it a sacrament, as the Book of Common Prayer refers to it, a sign or a sacrament of the relationship between the bridegroom, Christ, and the bride, the church. That is, it's a relationship in which you're not going to simply write a certificate of divorce and send the wife away. At least we hope not, right? We hope that doesn't occur. So this is sort of, I think, a helpful point, right? Of what we're seeing now is, and I think this is really hugely important. This is also part, I think, of the sort of the biblical vision of human sexuality. One of the problems with a lot of thinking about human sexuality today is that it reduces human sexuality essentially down to simply the level of biology. What do we want at any given moment? What do we sort of think might make us happy or whatever? What we saw in the movie that we saw, or what does it look like in advertisements? Da-da-da-da-da. What we're being told here is that it's impossible to separate out the physical, the spiritual, and the emotional. Human beings have been made in such a way that those three things are essential components of who we are. And you can't sort of pretend, right, that the physical can merely be separated from the spiritual and separated from the emotional. And therefore, right, one of the purposes of marriage is to make sure that in the relationship between husband and wife, right, the physical, the spiritual, and the emotional are all brought together and remain together and somehow aren't like pulled apart. So you got like little fragments and things like that, like floating around. So this is all part sort of like of a grander vision that we just want to be very, very aware of as we look at these different laws in Deuteronomy. So let's go back to Deuteronomy 22. I'll say a few things about it. Particularly, I want us to take just a quick look. This is Deuteronomy 22. I think it's 22. Yeah, 22:22. So we have a series of laws that are really concerned about protecting and preserving marriage, about limiting sort of what husbands can do. And in Deuteronomy 22:22, we find this: If a man is found lying with the wife of another man, both of them shall die. The man who lay with the woman, and the woman, and the woman. So you shall purge the evil from Israel. Now, notice here, this story is important at a number of levels, but it's important, once again, for thinking about something that happens later on. Remember the story in John 8, where a woman who supposedly has been caught in adultery is brought before Jesus? And once again, it's like a test, right? The Pharisees bring this woman who supposedly was caught in the act of adultery. She's brought before him, and they kind of say, okay, Jesus, we caught this woman in the act of adultery. So you're like, okay, and how did that come about? What were you doing? Anyway, what would you do with this woman? Right? And clearly, right, what's going on here is they're kind of trying to make the case that Jesus is sort of like soft on sin. Right? That's what they want to do here. So remember, Jesus actually doesn't say anything to begin with. Remember, he kind of writes in the sand. And some people have hypothesized, I think rather perhaps correctly, that Jesus is actually thinking of Deuteronomy 22:22. And what he writes in the sand is, where is the man? You caught this woman, you say, in the act of adultery. I may be a country boy from Galilee, but I know that in order to commit adultery, there has to be like one other person involved. And like, where is he? That is, what Jesus is doing, right, is he's making a really important point. He's making a point here, right, that the prohibition against adultery applies equally to men and women. Now, once again, I think we want to appreciate what's going on here, right? So, in the ancient world, particularly, the higher you were up in society, the purpose of marriage was to provide for legitimate heirs and offspring. It in no way implied sexual fidelity to your wife. Okay? So in Greek and Roman culture, it was accepted, right? That you might be married, but you might have a number of women on the side, you might be visiting prostitutes. All that was completely acceptable. You got married so you could have legitimate children by your wife who would inherit, but you had a whole other life out there that was for fun, quote unquote. Deuteronomy is now introducing a very, very different vision and saying, oh, no. This idea of marital fidelity applies equally to both husbands and wives. That's part of God's vision too. So I think it's a really important provision to look at. Now I want to just move forward just a little bit There's a lot of stuff here that we could look at. I want to highlight a few things. So let's take a look at Deuteronomy 23:15 and following. Once again, we're getting another vision of God's vision for society. So Deuteronomy 23:15, basically to Deuteronomy 25. I'll just go ahead and read it, and I'll say a few things about it. You shall not give up to his master a slave who has escaped from his master to you. He shall dwell with you in your midst, in the place that he shall choose, within one of your towns, wherever it suits him. You shall not wrong him. I'll come back to that. None of the daughters of Israel shall be a cult prostitute, and none of the sons of Israel shall be a cult prostitute. You shall not bring the fee of a prostitute or the wages of a dog into the house of the Lord your God in payment for any vow, for both these are an abomination to the Lord your God. You shall not charge interest on loans to your brother, interest on money, interest on food, interest on anything that is lent for interest. You may charge a foreigner interest, but you may not charge your brother interest, that the Lord your God may bless you in all that you undertake in the land that you are entering to take possession of it. If you make a vow to the Lord your God, you shall not delay in fulfilling it, for the Lord your God will surely require it of you, and you will be guilty of sin. But if you will refrain from vowing, you will not be guilty of sin. You shall be careful to do what is passed your lips, for you have voluntarily vowed to the Lord your God that you have promised with your mouth. If you go in your neighbor's vineyard, you may eat your fill of grapes, as many as you wish, but you shall not put any in your bag. If you go into your neighbor's standing grain, you may pluck ears with your hand, but you may not put a sickle into your neighbor's standing grain. Okay, so remember that. Don't put a sickle to your neighbor's standing grain. Let's go back and take a look at this. Once again, this is one of these things where you have to kind of look at the specifics and then kind of see like what they're pointing to, okay? So thing number one. And this was like a radically sort of different law from all the surrounding culture. If someone has escaped from slavery and they come to you, someone who's an Israelite, right? It's your obligation not to send them back. They actually now have a right to stay with you or in an area where you are. That's a really important provision, I think, right? This, of course, gives us a context, remember, for Paul's letter to Philemon, where Onesimus, remember, is Philemon's escaped slave. And Paul's arguing for Philemon to take him back, but not as a slave, but as a brother. It's a really, really important point. Also, another thing here, and this, once again, this is going to sound strange here. The prohibition against having sons or daughters become what are called here cult prostitutes. You're asking yourself, what's a cult prostitute? A prostitute is a member of a cult, or something like that. No. One of the features of Canaanite religion was what we call cult prostitution. So many of the temples to Canaanite gods and goddesses had both male and female prostitutes, and the idea was that you went and visited one of these prostitutes, and in visiting them, the understanding was you were getting like a blessing from the god or goddess that resided in that temple. Okay, that was the idea. And this is really important. These were kind of like high status jobs. Okay, if you were like a cult prostitute, right? There was some like prestige to it. You had videos on TikTok, and you drove a Mercedes, and people gawked and gaped after you. Okay. Here, once again, right? Deuteronomy's doing something really important, and it's saying, look, these jobs may appear to be desirable to a lot of people. They may come with a lot of status and et cetera, but that's not something that your children are to do because you're different. I'm calling you to be different. Okay? So once again, a really important point. Notice also the provision against charging interest on loans to fellow Israelites, right? And here, right, we just want to remember, right, that basically, we don't have people with credit cards and mortgages and, that's, way far away. What's happening here with most loans, right, is it's most likely, right, somebody has a small farm. They have a bad year one year, no crop or insufficient crop. They need to borrow some money to tide them over to the next harvest, and so they're loaned that money. The idea here is that if you loan that money, right, you're not to charge interest. Because in effect, right, that's almost a sort of heap abuse on this person's misfortune. So don't charge interest, okay? You're providing sustenance by providing the loan. They'll pay the loan back, but you're not to charge interest on top of that. Also, this provision about going into someone's vineyard or someone's field, right? There's actually a story about this, remember, in the 12th chapter of the Gospel of Matthew, where Jesus and his disciples are walking through a grain field on the Sabbath, remember? And the disciples start plucking the grain to sort of make an early version of like granola bars or something like that, and they eat the granola. And remember, the Pharisees apparently are like hiding in the field because they like pop up and they say, we caught you working on the Sabbath. Knew it was going to happen, right? Actually, this story is referring back to this provision. So if you wander into your neighbor's vineyard or your neighbor's grain field, you're free to eat some of what's there. You can pluck some grapes. You can get some of the grain. And the reason for that is, remember, the grapes and the grain are growing on the land. The land belongs to God. It's given for the sustenance of the people of Israel. So, yeah, you can take some grapes or you can get a little bit of grain. You can't, though, abuse this privilege, right? You can't say, got a couple grapes, and, oh, these grapes are really good, and I just happen to have this big bag here, and you start filling it out. Then you've transgressed, right, the ability to eat the grain. Now you've moved to theft. Okay, so you want to watch that. Once again, notice I think what's going on here. We're thinking about a society or a social order that's fundamentally covenantal, in which the question that's in everyone's minds uppermost, right, is what do we owe to one another? What's my obligation to you? What's your obligation to me? And we're thinking about what those obligations look like in the larger context of God's covenant, right? We're called to be his people. How do our lives look different from those around us, okay? And, right, and this is the other part, you're going to have the surrounding Canaanite neighbors kind of looking at the people of Israel and saying, those people are nuts. I mean, they don't charge interest. They let their neighbors come through the grain field and pluck stuff. And, escaped slaves come to them and they don't take them back to the master for a reward. What's wrong with them? They're crazy. Once again, this is part of Israel's role of being a holy people. Now, a couple more laws, and then we'll need to stop. Look at this is Deuteronomy 24, starting about verse 10. Once again, some more laws that have to deal with kind of social relationships among people. When you take your neighbor, when you make your neighbor a loan of any sort, you shall not go into his house to collect his pledge. You shall stand outside, and the man to whom you make the loan shall bring the pledge out to you. And if he's a poor man, you shall not sleep in his pledge. You shall restore to him the pledge as the sun sets, that he may sleep in his cloak and bless you. And it shall be righteousness for you before the Lord your God. So once again, this is a covenantal society, right? So let's say that I borrow money from Lana here, $3,000. She's loaned me $3,000 because I'm like going through a rough time. And as sort of security, right, I've got like a cloak. And the cloak, of course, in this age, right, is also like your nighttime blanket. Okay? So Lana takes my cloak as security for the $3,000, right? But there are two limitations on this. First, she can't come into my house and like take it from me. I have to walk outside my house and hand it to her. And then at night, she has to give the cloak back to me because, right, the cloak is my bed. Now, the next day she can have it back, okay? But she can't keep it so that I'm like, you know, kind of shivering at night or something like that. Now, notice once again what's going on here, right? I have borrowed money from Lana. She now has kind of like some power over me because I now owe her $3,000. She can't charge me interest, but which I know Lana wouldn't do that anyway. But notice here, the idea is just because I've borrowed money, that doesn't mean that I can now be like degraded and dehumanized by having somebody like march into my house, take my cloak from off my back, and then like keep it forever until I repay the loan while I freeze to death at night. No, we're going to avoid that. Okay, so I think it's like a really important point to recognize. One final thing. This is 24:14. You shall not oppress a hired worker who is poor and needy, whether he is one of your brothers or a sojourner who is in your land or within your towns. You shall give him his wages on the same day before the sun sets, for he is poor, and counts on it, lest he cry out against the Lord and you be guilty of sin. So once again, right, this is a society, right, where you've got day laborers. So let's say we'll go back to Lana. Lana has a big vineyard, and like we're all working in Lana's vineyard, right, harvesting our grapes. So the idea here is that when the day comes to an end, Lana has to pay us all our wages right then. And the reason for that is, right, for most of us, the money that we just earned is going to buy dinner that night and breakfast the next morning. If Lana doesn't pay us at the end of the day, probably most of us aren't going to be eating anytime soon. Okay, so once again, right, we're kind of vulnerable. We're in Lana's employees. She doesn't really like have to pay us if she doesn't really want to. But the law of Moses requires her to, because it's taking into account our vulnerability. Okay, of course, I know Lana would never withhold our wages anyway, and she'd probably be like a really, really great employer, and probably even like give us all bonuses at the end of the day and that kind of stuff. Okay, well, when we meet again in September, we'll finish Deuteronomy 24, and our goal will be to finish the book of Deuteronomy and to get into the book of Joshua and read about the settling of the land.